Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King had attended and got on well with the new king. The royal visit was agreed upon in principle. 2 years later, the proposal became a reality.
1939 was a great event, and unfortunately it's sometimes misrepresented in accounts now, shown from a British or American perspective. And it's often presented as, an attempt to get Canada to be at the side of Britain when the war came. And there was an element of that, or to encourage the United States to be good friends because the American portion of the trip. And that all happened. I mean, that was a result of the trip. But the trip itself was always a Canadian initiative. It wasn't the British government that came up with the idea. It was Lord Tweedsmuir, the Governor-General, and Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister, who organized, initiated, and ran this trip. And from the Canadian point of view, it was very much a statement of Canadian, not independence, because we were independent, not anti-British nationalism, but within the context of the British Commonwealth, it was a chance to assert Canadian autonomy and Canadian importance and primacy. And you see that throughout the tour.
Prime Minister Mackenzie King traveled with the royal couple for the entire tour. Months prior to the visit, he wrote in his diary that he could think of little else. He was determined that Canadians should be in charge of the royal tour, and this included him welcoming the King and Queen when their ship arrived.
Well, I think it was one of those endless Canadian arguments, which official greets the dignitaries. We have it almost every time the present Queen comes to Canada. There's usually a little battle that we rarely hear about between the Lieutenant Governor of the province and the Governor-General in Ottawa. Who is to greet the Queen? Everybody wants to greet the dignitary, especially if it's monarchy. In this case, it was the Governor-General in 1939, Lord Tweedsmuir, and he thought he should meet the King and Queen when they docked in Quebec City. Mackenzie King said no. The various statutes earlier in the century that made Canada a dominion and a self-governing dominion with control of its foreign policy. No, the Prime Minister should greet them and should accompany them across the country. So Mackenzie King won out.
The American portion of the trip, Mackenzie King made it quite clear that he was going as the senior advisor to the King. So when the King was in the United States, his minister in attendance was not the British official, the British Prime Minister or British Minister, it was the Canadian Prime Minister, making it clear that Canada was the United States neighbor. So we not only made it a Canadian event in Canada, we made sure the American portion was seen as a Canadian event. So you had that important constitutional side, and you look at the newspaper coverage, and it's fascinating. I've seen one headline that said, the day the King was in Ottawa, Ottawa is now the capital of the empire, because the King was present in Ottawa. So even when they looked at imperial side, it was, yes, we're the center of the empire when the King is here, not London. Ottawa is the center. So there was this Canadian nationalism evident throughout the tour. And the images of 39 that have remained, I think, are all very Canadian. Again, unveiling the War Memorial, coming to the King's Plate here in Toronto, the train that took them across the country, the image of the train going through the Rockies or the prairies. These are very distinct Canadian images. So that was an important part.
The month-long tour took King George VI and Queen Elizabeth from coast to coast. From busy cities to small-town whistle stops, millions of Canadians waited for hours, sometimes days, to get a glimpse of the royal couple in person. After Montreal, it was on to Ottawa. Here the King gave royal assent to 9 bills, unveiled the new War Memorial, and presided over an age-old military ceremony, trooping the colour. The Queen laid the cornerstone of the new Supreme Court building. Then it was on to Toronto, where the couple met the Dion quintuplets, Canada's sweethearts of the day. The royal tour then proceeded westward. In Winnipeg, they were greeted by a crowd of tens of thousands. None seemed to mind the record rainfall that drenched the city that day. Neither did the King. He insisted on using an open car for the motorcade. No act could have more endeared them to the people, wrote one reporter. Peg welcome is epic, read the headlines. Another reporter remarked, It was an epic of love of his Manitoba people for their king, and of their king for his people. Across the prairies, the story was the same. Small towns were swamped by people who had traveled from remote communities to catch sight of the king and queen. In the Saskatchewan town of Melville, the town's population of 4,000 rose to 60,000 for the day. The king and queen spontaneously mingled with the crowd. One British reporter wrote, "In England, I have never witnessed such descent into the crowd without prearrangement." The king was equally as overwhelmed. In a telegram, he wrote, "The Queen and I will not easily forget the scene that greeted us at Melville."
I think the surprise in the prairies, where it was known that there was a high percentage of population from Eastern Europe, Ukrainians, Poles, etc., how would they react to a monarchy that was based in London, that was the monarchy of the Commonwealth, but did they identify with Canada and the Commonwealth and this monarchy? Well, they came out in force and put up big signs in places like Biggar, Saskatchewan, "Welcome Your Majesties." And I talked to a woman of Ukrainian descent who years later became the Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan. And she was there as a little girl, and she told me, yes, we Ukrainian Canadians were just as enthusiastic about royalty and about this lovely queen with the eyes that could apparently look at all of us individually. We were as enthusiastic as the Scots Canadians, the English Canadians, the Welsh Canadians.
This unbridled enthusiasm was echoed at every train stop, at every motorcade, and at every ceremony. The reception in British Columbia was equally as passionate. Mackenzie King wrote in his diary, "Without question, Victoria has left the most pleasing of all impressions. It was a crowning gem." It was also here in British Columbia where one spontaneous event helped turn "O Canada" into our national anthem.
That's an interesting story. On the tour, someone in British Columbia said, after God Save the King was sung, "Why don't we sing O Canada?" And the king said, "Who's going to sing it?" And somebody started it off, and the king stood at attention. And the official historian on the royal tour argued that this was the first time, well, of course it was the first time, that a monarch had recognized this hymn, popular folk song, which years and years later, half a century later, became the national anthem.
The tour then headed back east to Jasper, Edmonton, Saskatoon, Sudbury, and through a number of Ontario towns. In Kitchener, the population tripled for the day. After a short trip to the United States, they visited eastern Quebec and the Maritimes, stopping off in Newfoundland on the way back to Britain.
The other thing that made the tour, I think, so fascinating are all the anecdotes. That's how an event, royal or otherwise, lives on into other generations. It's the little stories of people the day they met the king or queen, and that generation is largely gone now. They were the lovely story of the mayor of Montreal, Camille Hanoud, who forgot to wear his chain of office, and the king asked him, don't mayors have chains of office? And Hanoud said, "Oh yes, your majesty, but I only wear it on special occasions." He got flustered, and that became a joke in the royal family that they would talk about when they were getting ready for so special events. Is this a special occasion? That became an in-joke. There was a story out in Winnipeg that's gone down in legend as well. The king and the queen were accompanied by the prime minister, Mackenzie King, and the mayor of Winnipeg's name was John Queen. So the local radio announcer, as he's starting to describe the occasion, he's got the king, the queen, Mr. King and Mr. Queen, and shaking hands, and he gets all tongue-twisted before he finishes it. And so those are the things that made the tour not only come alive for the people at the time, but for the generations that followed, as these stories have remained in history.
History was also preserved on film. Cameramen followed the royal couple as they traveled across Canada. It was also the first royal tour where photographs taken in the morning could be published the next day. Technology was changing the face of the monarchy.
Well, that was very important. The media, we tend to think that media is a sort of late 20th century invention. But the officials who organized the tour in Britain and in Canada were aware of the power of the media, and both radio, moving pictures, and of course the speeches. And on one of the trains, there were two trains. One was for the photographers from the National Film Board, which had just been created, both moving photography and still photography. And they developed their photographs as they went along from town to town. Those photos then were sent over by wires to newspapers across the country and around the world. Every movie in the 1930s and 40s and even the 50s had a short newsreel section before the movie. And this royal tour wasn't quite instantaneously broadcast as we're accustomed today, as with the recent royal wedding. But it was almost instantaneous, and for 1939 it was almost a miracle that when the King and Queen finished their tour, say, of Winnipeg, in Canada the next day, people were watching it on newsreels. So I think it was the first time that the media came into its own as the beginnings of this almost instantaneous world that we live in today.
Radio, newspapers, and film helped make the royal couple more accessible.
Film generally makes people more human. Not only did it popularize the monarchy and convince Canadians and ultimately the British and other Commonwealth countries that this couple was the perfect couple to be king and queen, but as Mackenzie King and others pointed out, it also unified Canada.
One of the important roles of a royal tour is not only takes the member of the royal family across the country, but it takes the Canadian people with them to places that they maybe should know about in Canada, but haven't. And that hasn't changed from the 1860s to the 21st century.
Midway during the tour, one reporter wrote, "On this trip, the King and Queen have smashed all precedents in repeatedly walking without prearrangement straight into the crowds." The royal walkabouts, as they're now referred to, became an essential part of the 1939 tour. The first and perhaps most famous occurred after the official unveiling of the National War Memorial in Ottawa. The royal couple unexpectedly plunged into a crowd of First World War veterans, shaking hands and talking with the old soldiers. For more than 30 minutes, they broke with official protocol and spontaneously circulated with the public. One reporter wrote, "The royal couple were cut off from all entourage, lost all officialdom in a great sea of Canada's returned soldiers. A scene that Britons have never seen before." Behind the scenes, the King's secretaries and security staff were anxious. Never had the King and Queen so freely interacted with people in the crowd.
The security issue is interesting in 1939. I think today we think that we're living in an age of terrorism. And of course we know that for the royal wedding there was millions of dollars spent on security. There was a lot of money spent on the 1939 tour. For instance, there were two trains, one for the photographers and some of the security, went ahead of the royal train by half an hour to check for bombs. At every crossing, not just every road crossing, but even when there was a crossing in a farmer's field, and sometimes there were old crossings with no roads, they hired local farmers to stand as the train went by all across Canada. Planes were not allowed to come within 3 miles, 5 kilometers, say, off the royal train. Now that is surprising because we think of the plane after 9/11 especially as a modern device of terrorism. It was thought of then. Lots of Secret Service on that trip in 39, and Mounties who were, there were 4 big Mounties at all times, always near the King and Queen. In the photographs, you really have to look hard to see in the photographs and the moving images, but it's there. And it cost a lot of money. We have to remember that in Paris only 3 years earlier, I think it was, a cousin of the king, who happened to be the king of Yugoslavia, was assassinated. So in the 20th century, monarchs were assassinated. We forget that. So there was concern. There were also concerns about certain ethnic groups in Canada who hated the British.
But the majority of Canadians embraced King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. Throughout the 1939 tour, there was an outpouring of affection and loyalty towards the royal couple. That surprised even them.
One of the important things was that it was Canadians embracing them as their king. The headlines of the newspapers, it was the King of Canada. It wasn't the British king. I mean, of course we were British. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't anti-British. But it was